Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Thanks sponsors, Topps Panini Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Hug the Scott Auctions, Mike's Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. Phil Rosenzweig, we started out talking about his book. The guy has really researched it. We're talking about 1912, some of the greats before Phil was born, before I was born, but very enjoyable conversation with Phil, a former professor. And here's the last part of it. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy.
So it raises the question, who is behind all this? I think there's a very strong likelihood that what the American Tobacco Company did, it's not experts in Indian chiefs and flags of the world and lighthouses or baseball. It contracted out. And I think the folks they contracted out to for the T202 set was Spalding. Why do I think this? Because the portraits that were used for the T205s and then the T202s appear in the 1911 Spalding Guide, photographs of every player on the teams taken by the Paul Thompson studio in Boston in the Spalding Guide, then used in T205 and T202. Action photographs on the center panels, the plurality of them, were taken either by Charles Conlon in New York or Louis Van Oyen in Cleveland, and their work features very prominently in the Spalding Guide. So my guess is Spalding had their choice of those photos. And the captions, there's a couple examples and one very clear example of verbatim text on the back of one of the T202s, same word for word as in the Spalding Guide. So very likely Hassan said, "Hey, Spalding, can you put this set together for us?"
They went the extra mile. And because it wasn't just about the cards as much as about the brand, it's in their tobacco pack. I'm struck that when the baseball cards got really popular and probably more important than the underlying brand in some cases for these regional sets that came out, certainly in the 70s and 80s and 90s, very little thought to the quality of the cards that came out that were promoting a brand, some of these little box sets. It makes me think now that those brands were cheesy. I did read your book, and I just was getting the impression that Hassan was a high-end tobacco because of the high end of the cards. Whereas Old Mill or Polar Bear, those are more maybe popular brands.
I really can't say anything about the price point or that kind of marketing appeal. I can say I have read the Hassan cork tip cigarette, because of the cork tips, was considered an innovation. And it certainly was one of the leading brands for at least a couple of years there. But I think this notion of attention to detail in the production and the care taken really does show itself.
The baseball you're talking about in the 1912 glory year is East Coast, is St. Louis at best.
You're right. They went as far as St. Louis, but interestingly, the players, you will have many who came farther afield. So Frank Chance is from California, and he's described as being from the land of grapes and raisins in Fresno. Hal Chase was from California. Fred Snodgrass was from California. Of course, Tris Speaker was from Texas. But the thing I found really curious, Jim, is the writers, I believe they were with Spalding. They were based in Boston and New York. And a lot of them, I'm convinced, had never been farther west, maybe Cleveland. And so they write about Tris Speaker, this wild cowboy from the plains of North Texas, and Chase from this weird place out in California, which of course where I'm from. You're right. There were players, though, who came from those parts of the country, but they were still a little bit off the radar screen.
Those states we're talking about are so populous now that you would think they would have been dominating any league they're in. And nowadays they are. California high school football, baseball, basketball, Texas high school football, baseball, basketball are populating many of the universities and many of the leagues. I guess I'm pushing back that it wasn't a national pastime in the sense of all of America equally.
I think that's correct. However, if you were a really top young baseball player in California, many of them, their dream was to go and play in the major league. So Fred Snodgrass came to play for the Giants, and a few others I'm thinking of, maybe Oscar Stanage, who went to Detroit, and some others. Yeah, there are players who came from various parts, but you're right, there weren't that many people in those states at that time. But one of the things I try to document On the back of the caption, it says where the players have come from in terms of teams they played for. I looked up a lot of them. Some of them were semi-pro teams. You had guys in Chicago who played for semi-pro teams that were sponsored by department stores. Bob Harmon of the St. Louis Cardinals, who was playing for a mining town in Arizona near the New Mexico border, for a company town there. So you had industries that were fielding teams, semi-pro teams and so forth. But eventually, after 1903, there was organized a draft, and you had these levels, D and C and B and A levels, and you had major league teams then that would draft players. You didn't yet have a farm system, but you did have some major league teams that owned a specific minor league team that was a feeder to them. That was something that was evolving at the time. The farm system under Branch Rickey and others came a bit later, but you did have agreements between some major league teams and some top minor league teams.
I've always thought that Honus Wagner, as a player, not just the card, but as a player, was underrated, not understood, because by 1912, we hear a lot about Cobb. And so I'm just wondering, is Christy Mathewson another guy that is not getting the full respect that he ought to get in terms of being such an amazing player and story and everything? Have you run across that in terms of
you're
Walter Johnson?
Talking about two of the first five elected to the Hall of Fame. Pretty hard to say they weren't getting their.
No, I'm talking about for collectors.
For collectors.
I don't think collectors have him in the top rank, even though they should.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. A guy like Mathewson was so great for so long, but he was not controversial. Take Shoeless Joe Jackson, okay? My gosh, you have a Cracker Jack Jackson card. Look how much that is worth. I heard an interview with Josh Rawitch, the president of the Hall of Fame. This whole question about Shoeless Joe Jackson came up, and one of the hypotheses is that if Shoeless Joe Jackson is ever admitted to the Hall of Fame, his appeal is going to go down, because there's this kind of forbidden fruit aspect to him. Mathewson was the Christian gentleman. He was a good sport. He was magnanimous. He was so honest that umpires would sometimes ask his opinion. Maybe there isn't the romance around that sort of thing there is around somebody who gets busted for throwing games. So that's possible. One more thing about Mathewson. So he's very prominent in this set, and his caption on the back, that was the real aha for me, because it talks about how he beat the Athletics 3 times in 1905. Everybody knows that because those were 3 World Series wins. But then it talks about absolutely subduing the Yankees, including 14 strikeouts in a game. And I thought, hang on, when did he ever pitch against the Yankees? They never played in the World Series. There was no interleague play in those days. So I looked that up. In many of the major cities, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, that had 2 teams, if neither team was playing in the World Series, at the time of the World Series, those teams would play what was called the City Series. The City Series, strictly speaking, is an exhibition game. So you will not see the records of that in either regular season or postseason. But I will tell you, for the players, for the fans, for the writers, and definitely for the owners, these were big games and everybody cared about them. So I went back to look at that 1910 City Series when, in fact, Mathewson pitched. I think he beat the Yankees 4 times in 8 games. And that's what that's about. So I learned quite a bit, and I tried to annotate that and present that in the text of the book. If you look at Total Baseball, one of the great encyclopedias, they have a whole section in the back that lists all of these. In 1912, and I talk about this in my book, at the same time that the Giants were playing the Red Sox in the World Series, there was a City Series in Philadelphia, in St. Louis, and in Chicago. One in Chicago became very controversial and ended up with Frank Chance being fired, partly because of the White Sox, thanks to Big Ed Walsh and his great pitching, beating the Cubs, who had a lead and then lost it. If you want to talk about a player who I think does not get the respect that he should, it's probably Big Ed Walsh. My gosh. He won 40 some years. He pitched 400 innings. He was just a workhorse and very reliable and a great pitcher.
In your book, you talked about these field days. I just got a hoot. Was that 100 years ahead of its time? And now it's too late because the players would want to be compensated for these contests of base running and throwing and all that stuff. They don't have precision measurements, but running the bases and throwing it in from the outfield or trying to hit a target and all that stuff. Was that discontinued, or were you just tracking only the years that were of relevance to you? And can you explain the concept? Because I thought it was fascinating. Again, probably an off-day thing.
It was not an off-day thing. On the back of a card of Hans Lobert, who was known to be very fast, it said he had the record for circling the bases in, 13.25 seconds. Somebody else is said to have the record for the longest ball fungo hitting contest. So I thought, what's this all about? I looked it up, and the first one was, I think, 1908. Gary Herman, president of the National League, but was with Cincinnati. It was his brainchild to have, before a game, I think it was Cincinnati against Pittsburgh, before a game, they had the players there and invited some other players, including minor leaguers, to what they call this field day. So who can throw the ball the farthest? Who can hit the farthest fungo? They had one where they would erect a pole at second base with a little flag, a little target, and have catchers try to hit the targets. Accuracy for throwing by catchers. Who runs the bases the fastest? Who can go from home to first the fastest? And they did this several years running. One that I document in Chicago, what was interesting was a number of players took part in it. And I thought, wait a minute, their team was playing somewhere. And I looked it up, and apparently certain players were allowed to play hooky, take a day off, take the train to Chicago, participate in this. So it's quite exciting. I don't know when they stopped. I looked at it for the few years leading up to 1912. It may have gone a bit after that. But it's rather remarkable. And as I said, there were some minor leaguers who participated along with the major leaguers. And these took place typically in September after the minor league season had ended. So you had a little more participation there. And the guys who were playing hooky, some of them were with teams that were either far out of the pennant race or had already clinched. So they were able to go. I'm not sure they would have allowed them to leave their team during a game in May or June.
Well, you describe a simpler time, and this is beautiful work of art going through the 1912 season and seeing how the Giants are just running away with it. Major League Baseball now would be in a panic if a team at the All-Star break was up by 15 games or something. They'd say, we've got to fix that. And now they've got all these wild cards. But was there a drop-off of interest, or are people still rooting their team, even if you're in fifth place with no chance of, do they just love the game? Was it just that much simpler in those days?
In fairness, the attendance in some of these places was quite low. St. Louis Browns weren't drawing very well, and some other teams weren't drawing very well. On one hand, the basic economic model had gotten to the point where owners could build these concrete and steel stadiums, but that didn't mean all of them were drawing very well. However, 2 years later, you had the Federal League, because enough owners are making money that you now have rivals saying maybe there's room for a league. And you had poaching of players, you had multi-year contracts, because after 1903, the agreement that was put in place then was a way to keep the damper on salaries and to avoid the kind of competition and salary jumping that had happened up until 1903.
Every collector understands about the Federal League because of Cracker Jacks, 1914 and 1915, and seeing that. I really enjoyed reading your book. I hope people will purchase it. I didn't look at the price until I got finished, and I thought, this is a bargain. Colored photos.
The other thing I've put in the book that I've collected over the years are postcards of baseball stadiums.
Right.
You see a lot of high-res scans of stadiums. If you've got a Christy Mathewson T205 and a Christy Mathewson T202 that also has a center panel and another, is the T202 going to be the same price, more, less? I get the feeling those additional elements do not add to the value, but for some, maybe it does.
It's a hindrance for probably more than some. A lot of collectors are purists. However, having said that, what I saw, my role in the hobby was try to understand that, but not to make that call other than, and there are people that think, you know what, I want to get a great looking Christy Mathewson card. And if it's got a side card or, and somebody values that lesser, then that's my gain that I'm going to buy that. And so I think people don't grumble. Now, when you go to sell, you think, hey, this is a Christy Mathewson card that's even tougher than a T205. I want big bucks for that. The secondary market is fickle, but that's always been the case. If it's a Mickey Mantle autograph ball, if it's Mickey Mantle and Jim and Phil, no matter whether we had some special moment, it's better if it's just a Mickey Mantle ball.
Yeah, it's funny how that works. But
it's funny how that works. But if the story, and again, that's one of the beauties of the triple folders, is that what you've unfolded in your book is you explain the story of bringing this together, that this was a loving work of art of putting together the cards. Nobody mailed it in on that.
No, it really is very high quality.
The verbiage.
Yeah.
And same thing in your book. You took time, you can tell. And I'm glad you gave credit to the art design guy, because it needs to be done that way. It just can't be a book that just has all the cards in the same place. So it moves around and has a visual appeal.
Good. Thank you. I hope we can tell people where they can find a copy. I have a website that's pmrbooks.com/T202. People can go order it there, or it's also on Amazon. It is better for me if you come directly to me. But I also know Amazon is a go-to place for a lot of people.
I love it when people have a passion project and complete it. Phil, you complete it. It's my story too. You get the idea, and a lot of people have the idea, but it's in the execution. It's well executed. Well done.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.